talk about Marxism. And so, since we've already covered Marxism a couple of times in this class, we're just going to do some reminders, just as some like quick reminders of terms. How does this apply to international relations? Because Marxist theory was not originally like applied to international relations, but that is something that got extensively done later when we get to people like Lenin and Mao. So, what is the bourgeoisie?
The people that control the means of production and get the profits of things.
Yes, the people that own the means of production and therefore profit from other people's labor. Who are the proletariat?
The working class.
The working class? What does that mean?
The people that are being used for their labor.
Yes, the people who are actually working the means of production and the only thing they own is their labor. What is the means of production?
The things that the bourgeoisie own that let them produce wealth using labor.
Sure. Can we get some examples?
Like a factory.
Like a factory, yes. Oftentimes when we're trying to define means of production, it might be more helpful to just have examples. Because it's kind of difficult to define means of production without saying, well, it's the thing that you use to produce things. But yes, factories, sometimes restaurants, those can also be means of production. Though today, one of the things that's really essential to remember is that very rarely is a thing produced all in one place. If I have, say, a pair of Nike shoes, there is probably a different place that produced the plastic that makes the outside of the shoe, and a different place that produced the rubber that's going to make the sole of the shoe, and then they're probably actually assembled in like a Nike factory with those raw materials. And so when we say the means of production, we mean like there's a long line, like a sort of conga line of means of production these days. It's not just all happening in a single factory. What is the base? Alternate question. What's the superstructure?
The things in our minds that we view as a structured reality that makes us all, like, be a part of capitalism.
That is sort of one of the effects of the superstructure. We're getting closer.
Is the base like the means of production, and then it's also like the stuff that like influences the means of production?
Do you have an example?
Like the government, like specifically like capitalism?
Yeah. Yeah, so what we're looking at with the base is we are looking at the material means of economic exploitation. And so that can mean a lot of different things. That can be the actual means of production, it can be wage theft, which is really common, it can be housing, it can be government policy, etc. And then we also have the superstructure. The superstructure maintains the ideology of capitalism. So it's not the material means by which people are exploited, but it's the things that get people to accept their exploitation. And so usually here we're looking at like schools, we're looking at the media, we're looking at like just sort of the prevailing ways that we maintain the ideology of capitalism. And one of the things that's important is that the relationship between the base and the superstructure is not like a one-to-one. It's not just that like the superstructure informs the base. The base can also inform the superstructure. And so then you get this sort of feedback loop between ideology and material exploitation that are constantly informing one another. What is historical materialism?
A view of looking at history that looks at like what actually happened and the material things that have happened as opposed to like far off, far flung stuff.
So let's get rid of words like far off, far flung, and what actually happened. What does that then leave us with? What is historical materialism? Because this is not intended to be a judgment. This is intended to be two different competing views of history. The opposite of historical materialism is usually idealism. So what's the difference between historical materialism and idealism? When we originally talked about this, we used the example of the American Revolution. What does materialism mean? Let's think about that word first.
The stuff that exists in reality. And like things that happen in reality.
As opposed to what? Spiritual values.
Like
so,
or ideas.
So now we're getting the difference between physical reality and ideas. That's important. Are ideas not real?
Not necessarily.
They're like in our minds, but they aren't part of the external world beyond us.
Why not?
because ideas are in our brain but aren't part of the table.
But we have an idea of what a table is, right?
Yes.
And does that then inform how we make new tables?
Yes.
So it sounds like we make our ideas a reality. So then why does it matter that we have this distinction between materialism and idealism? So let's try and use an example here. What would an idealist explanation for the Revolutionary War be?
Freedom.
What does that mean? You just said the word freedom. That's not a complete
That is what
sentence.
an idealist would say. Just like the word freedom.
I don't think that's true.
Like ability. Sorry, you're looking for materialism?
Idealism, since that's probably what you learned in school. Why did the Revolutionary War happen?
Because the British raised their damn taxes too high and were restricting the freedom of the colonists.
Freedom of religion?
So freedom of religion, freedom of economic, economic self-determination, that sort of stuff. So we have these ideals of what society should be, and those ideals conflicted in the colonists' mind with their material reality. Now, what is the historical materialist explanation for the Revolutionary War? Historically speaking, one of the things that was happening as the American Revolution was the fall of feudalism. We were then transitioning to a new economic system, e.g. capitalism. One of the things that capitalism needed is its own version of lords. So we have this emerging merchant class that is interested in becoming the future bourgeoisie, or the new version of lords. In order for them to do that, they need to separate their wealth from existing monarchs. Now this happens in a bunch of different contexts. Slavery was a popular way to do this. Colonialism was a popular way to do this. That's the way that most people that were still within the British Empire did it. But for American colonists, all they needed was a little revolution. And then all of a sudden, you don't have King George who's looking to collect any more taxes. So, our materialist explanation says that a small merchant class was looking to materially benefit in some way from the emerging capitalist system and the move away from feudalism. An idealist explanation for the Revolutionary War would have said people felt oppressed and tried to throw off the shackles of oppression. One relies on looking at the material conditions in which people existed. One relies on looking at the state of mind in which people existed. Marxists are of the opinion that idealism is only ever a peripheral explanation. It's not that people didn't feel oppressed. They probably did. Rather, though, it's that that is not a sufficient explanation for historical events. So it's not that one of these explanations is real and one of them is fake. It's that one of them is insufficient, and sometimes even seeks to mystify capitalist production. And that is part of the function of the superstructure, is to mystify the material means of economic exploitation, e.g. the base, so that people don't feel the need to rebel against the base. And so today, capitalism is still woven in with our understandings of freedom, especially in the United States. And so not being a fan of capitalism is tantamount to sacrilege or being unpatriotic. Now, the difference between historical materialism and dialectical materialism is that first part, the dialect. We need two things to be in conversation with one another. So sometimes that can be our material understanding and our idealist understanding of a phenomenon, and by pointing them out and putting them in conversation with one another, we gain some new understandings. But there are often competing materialist explanations for a given event. That doesn't mean that either of those explanations is necessarily incorrect. It probably means that by putting them in conversation with one another, we can learn more about both of them and about the event itself. So that's the dialectical portion of dialectical materialism.
So like dialectical materialism, it's not necessarily a contradiction to each other, the two conversing things, it's just, they kind of play off each other sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it is a direct contradiction. Sometimes though, just by putting them in conversation with one another, we learn more. They add to one another instead of subtracting. So then what does any of this have to do with international relations theory? So one of the things that Marxist IR scholars are looking to prove is that capitalist modes of production and the modern sort of international relations system as we know them are not inevitable. They're not like these natural things that just come out of human nature. They are constructions. They are things that we produced because of certain historical processes. And if they can be produced, they can be changed. That is really important. One of the things that Marxists criticize about the liberal notions of international relations and the realist notions of international relations is that both of them think something about human nature. Realists think that humans are inherently competitive. Liberals think that humans are inherently cooperative. Marxists would say neither of those things are true. There is no such thing as human nature. And by believing that there is such a thing as human nature, you will lock us in to historical processes and you will lock us into the status quo. Marxists then also extend this idea to political economy. So political economy was not even a term that Marx himself came up with. Adam Smith actually did, fun fact. And so political economy just means the study of politics and economics together, that they affect one another and that you can't really know anything about one without knowing stuff about the other. It wasn't until more modern political scientists and economists in academia came about that they tried to separate these two things. The OG economist, Adam Smith, thought that they should be studied together. And so Marxists continue this idea and say that this then applies to international relations as a whole. It is critical that we understand the way that political systems affect economic ones and vice versa. If we don't understand that, we'll never understand people's motivations. We'll never understand why things happened the way that they did. Our dialectical materialism or our historical materialism won't make any sense if we don't look at these two things in tandem with one another. And this is not just true for the emergence of capitalism from feudalism, but it's also true in our modern day when we look at things like the Cold War. It is very difficult to explain the Cold War without getting into capitalist ideology.
So outside of looking at it as a whole, is it generally in the status quo looked at as two different? Okay,
That's why your political science degree and your economics degree are two different things
that's true.
at 99.9% of universities. Now the next thing that Marxist IR scholars started criticizing was this distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere. And this is a criticism that is actually carried most heavily by the feminist tradition of international relations studies. And so we'll look at it more in depth next class. But basically when we say the public sphere, we mean quote-unquote public life. So like politics, economics, government, this sort of stuff. Things that happen out in public spaces. And private spheres are things that happen in the home. Now, obviously, a cursory glance at, hey, politics kind of affects people's private lives, it seems like. Marxists and feminists would contend is very important. Because one of the things that both Marxists and feminists are really big on is the way that private inner life becomes political, becomes public. And that this distinction between private and public is usually just an excuse to ignore these quote-unquote private problems that are actually caused by public policy. And so the child tax credit's a great example of this. There were tons of Americans that were relying on the child tax credit, especially when we start looking at really low income brackets. And now that it's being taken away, inflation is getting worse, those people are in dire economic straits. And one of the things that we know is that poverty is one of the #1 predictors of things like future prison sentences, drug addiction, lack of education, all of these things that then turn around and become public issues. And so by by creating this distinction between public and private, we end up losing so much information. It becomes really difficult for us to then point to, okay, what are the actual causes of this problem? Because if we can't point to the actual causes, there's no way we're going to be able to solve it. And one of the things that Marxists also did was they reconceptualized our idea of international. This is especially true of Trotsky's interpretation of the Third International. So the Third International was Trotsky's idea that really the global proletariat are kind of all one community. And they are much more one community than they are in community with their individual countries. A working class person in Nicaragua has way more in common with a working class person in China than they do with the bourgeoisie in either of those places. And so this was the idea that instead of viewing ourselves as citizens of a country, we ought to view ourselves based on our class. that the class divide is the core contradiction. And by ignoring that core contradiction, you are fooling yourselves out of economic gains, out of revolution, out of political necessity, all kinds of things. Because one of the things that Marxists firmly believe is that class consciousness already exists for the bourgeoisie. They are well aware of their class position, and they do everything within their power to maintain it. And that the only people who are unaware of their class position are usually the proletariat, sometimes the petite bourgeoisie as well. And so by being unaware of their class position, it means it's impossible for them to change it. They don't even understand the problem. This also means that Marxists question the assumption that the international system is anarchy. They think that it's not, that it is ordered. It is ordered by classes. And if we can understand that, then we can much better understand a given actor in a given place. And this is going to get us into Lenin and Mao, because they are both the people who sort of took the idea of class and made it international. So we talked a little bit about Lenin and Mao last time. So does anybody remember the first word from this sentence? Blank is the highest stage of capitalism.
Imperialism.
Imperialism, absolutely. So Lenin believed that imperialism is just the way of making capitalism international. Blank is capitalism in crisis.
Fascism.
Fascism. And so Lenin firmly believed that the fascist phenomenon that he was seeing in Europe was a direct result of the crises of capitalism. So one of the things that was happening in, say, the 1920s, what was going on?
The Great Depression.
The Great Depression. And the Great Depression was global. And so this then, according to Lenin, is what gives rise to fascism. The bourgeoisie, and sometimes the petite bourgeoisie even, realize that they are losing their grasp on the proletariat. They are losing their control because people are now not seeing capitalism as a way for everyone to get a bigger piece of the pie, but are seeing the massive wealth gap that exists between them, who are now in dire economic straits, and the rich, who are not, which creates class consciousness. And so fascism is a way to then exert control in a more forceful manner than, say, democracy would allow. And this is what brings us to the party. Anybody remember what the party is?
It's a party external to the state.
It's external to the state. What does it do?
Does it help class consciousness develop? Or that was a really weird way to word it, but
It starts actually doing material things to show people that capitalism is not the way out.
Yes. So we start raising class consciousness. We can do this in a variety of ways. A lot of this is through just education. That's one of the things that the Black Panther Party was really famous for. It's one of the things that Fidel Castro did a lot, was just pure education of the masses. And then the other thing that's necessary, and this is what the Bolsheviks were really good at, is using the party to meet the people's material needs, to demonstrate that you don't need capitalism to meet your material needs, and you certainly don't need the state as we know it today to do so. So again, we can also look to the Black Panther Party as an example of this, with things like the breakfast program, free healthcare clinics, etc. So what does that mean about dual power? If the party is external to the state, then what does dual power mean?
when the state doesn't meet the needs, when the state doesn't meet the people's needs, the party will.
They do what the state should be doing.
So they do what the state should be doing, yes, but this tells us something about the party. Is they don't just have an external role to the state, it's that they can become the state. They have both a political project as well as a project that is focused directly on the needs of the people. Those are our dual prongs here. And then what is vanguardism?
The kind of leaders or the kind of like the government, but not really.
So the leaders of the party, yes, and there's an important stipulation in order to be a leader of the party, is Lenin believed that these vanguards needed to be professional revolutionaries. You did not have time to be part of the vanguard and have a day job. This often means that these people come from backgrounds which require their community to support them in a variety of ways during the revolution itself, because they're not able to go to a day job at Starbucks. They spend all of their time becoming professional revolutionaries. One great example of this in the United States would be leaders of the Black Panther Party. A lot of them did not have day jobs. They were supported by the party itself. Now, where Lenin started his focus on imperialism, Mao then greatly expanded this. One of the things that Mao wanted to add, especially to vanguardism, is the idea of the mass line. Now, the mass line says that you have to be responsible to the people. Yes, we do need leaders, we do need professional revolutionaries, Mao saw himself as one of them, and he kind of led an army about it, so he was probably correct. But that the only way for the revolution to maintain its success, and the only way for it to win at all when confronted with, the violence of the state apparatus, was to have the support of the people. And so that meant that the revolutionaries, the vanguard, had to then run their ideas by the people first, and had to put the people's needs and desires first. Mao also introduced three worlds theory. Now, we don't usually use the term third world or first world anymore, just because the way that they've gotten deployed is not great. But these ideas are still really important. And so in Mao's day, the first world was the Imperial Core, the United States, European allies, some colonies like Canada. And then the second world was the Eastern Bloc, the USSR and its allies. And then we had this third world. The third world were usually formerly colonized places. So we're talking most of South America, all of Africa. That's where our third world was located. And Mao was of the opinion that the global proletariat revolution needed to come from the third world, because they are the true global proletariat. And one of his examples was Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. And we often still see these today. Bolivia is definitely one of the places that has sort of the most revolutionary demands on the international stage. And now Mao thought that the revolution could only happen through a protracted people's war. So it's exactly what it sounds like. The people are at war with the state, and it's going to take a while. And he needed to be honest with people about that. They couldn't think that they could win the revolution in a year. It was going to be a lot longer than that. And there were going to be setbacks. There were going to be hard times. And Mao thought that in order to successfully wage a people's war, you had to have a cultural revolution. So the People's War is usually focused on the base, attacking the means of production and seizing them, taking them from the bourgeoisie. But you also need to attack the superstructure. So we need to tear down the cultural assumptions that uphold capitalist ideology in order to have a successful revolution. So then this gets us into people today who are very directly applying Marxist theory. And so one of Wallerstein's questions was, why do so many states become capitalist? If we truly believe it's not some inevitable law of the universe, then why does it keep happening? So Wallerstein thought that there were a couple of reasons for this. That first of all, we needed to talk about the core, or the Imperial Core. And so Wallerstein defined this as democratic governments who were providing high wages and accessible welfare. And then there was the semi-periphery, which was Wallerstein's idea of kind of the second world, which are usually authoritarian governments that were providing low wages with poor welfare. And then there was the periphery. This was often the third world. Non-democratic governments where wages are well below subsistence with no welfare. One of the questions we might ask today is, what about democratic governments with low wages and no access to welfare? Fascinating little conundrum that Wallerstein didn't really talk about. Though that assumes, I guess, that these places are actually democracies in the first place. So, one of the things that's important is that in this model, the only reason that the core can provide high wages and lots of access to welfare is because of the periphery. The periphery is who is providing the cheap labor and the resources. Now, sometimes this is also happening in the semi-periphery. When we look at, say, manufacturing especially, we're usually looking at semi-periphery countries. But oftentimes, the core resources themselves are extracted through borderline, if not outright, slave labor. And so this is one of the reasons that people are so critical of, say, the Green New Deal here in the United States. The argument is that the Green New Deal only gets to happen because of the amount of extraction that still happens in places like Africa. And therefore, the periphery is a requirement of capitalism. So this gets really important when we're talking about Marxism as well as colonialism, because things like the raw materials for AI, biotech, and cyber warfare are mined in specific places. But now it's not even just raw resources, it's potentially the data itself. And then we have Gramsci. You are probably intimately familiar with Gramsci's ideas, even if you didn't realize that he came up with them, because he is who started writing about hegemony. He's the one who coined the term and applied it the way that we use it today. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who was locked up for a long time because he lived under the Italian fascist state. And so one of the things that he thought was really important is that domination happens primarily on the basis of ideology, oftentimes. Like, it depends on it. Without ideology, we can never understand oppression. And that we have developed relationships of dependency, especially when we look at like the international scale. Now this could mean like Europe being dependent on the United States for defense, but that's not really what Gramsci was talking about. One of the things that Gramsci was living through was the making African countries, or formerly colonized countries, but especially in Africa, dependent on their former colonizers, i.e. through things like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. In order to get access to enough funds to build yourself up after having your labor and resources extracted for centuries, you needed access to raw capital. And you weren't getting that without going to your former oppressors, which allows former colonial powers like the United States, like the UK, like France, to keep their thumb on the formerly colonized, even if they're not technically colonized anymore. And now this is really important, because one of the things that Gramsci talks about a lot is the idea of manufactured consent. And manufactured consent often looks like an African country being forced to open its markets to free trade in order to gain access to a World Bank loan. Well, once its markets are open to free trade, the United States can just send over a bunch of companies to do all of that work and get all of the profit. And the actual African country itself never develops any infrastructure. We also saw this after Iraq. One of the things that was really popular after the US bombed the crap out of Iraq's infrastructure was sending over its own manufacturing companies to rebuild Iraqi infrastructure, thereby gaining all of the profits. Not only did they create the problem, they then created the solution and profited off of it. Now, did Iraq really have a choice? No! Their infrastructure had been bombed crap and they didn't have any way to repair it. And so this is then the idea of manufactured consent, is you don't really have a choice. But we act like you did. It's like, well, if you didn't like it, you shouldn't have let US companies in and not had running water or electricity. That's the alternative. The alternative is death. Not a real choice. And one of the things that Gramsci talks about is that liberal norms are essential to establishing this manufactured consent. So when we look at this on the NATO topic, now, NATO is definitely a bourgeoisie institution with an imperial agenda. However, that is not a link argument, and that is going to be critical for next year's topic. This is what people say when they mean it's a link to the status quo. You have just given us a fact that NATO is a bourgeoisie institution with an imperial agenda. Okay, what now? Okay, neat FYI. Instead, we need an explanation for why we should then be skeptical of the affirmative. And Marxists are very skeptical of a lot of international institutions. Not because they think that the stated goals of these institutions are bad, but because they think that in practice they're not actually these good liberal actors. They're imperialists. And so they would then say, I mean, we should have all seen the Russia invasion of Ukraine coming. NATO was literally like an encroaching imperialist on Russia and encircled them. We should have seen this coming. Now that doesn't justify Russia's actions in Ukraine, because it's really important to note that Russia's actions in Ukraine are also imperialist. But it's at least a predictable outcome. And unless we want to see this outcome again and again, we have to start taking a Marxist view of international relations. Now, in order to go that extra step, we need to figure out something in the affirmative, some portion that demonstrates the capitalist imperialism that Marxist authors are talking about. And so it needs to be, yes, this contributes to systems of imperialism. This maintains systems of imperialism. This creates, this manufactures consent for systems of imperialism. This actively upholds or props up the capitalist system. Doesn't it just exist within these institutions? It makes them better, and it makes them worse. Better in the sense that they are better at what they do. Worse in the sense for all the people who are actually being colonized.